Hello and welcome back to our complete platform game. This week we're going to be looking at adding controller input. For now we've just looked at keyboard and mouse, and honestly, that's mostly the way things are going to stay. Like, things would get a bit too complicated if I were to try and carry keyboard controls and gamepad controls throughout the entire of this series, but I do want to touch on them as they could be an important thing for you in the game you want to make, so I want to touch on them and give you an overview on how to get started with them. And it is also important to talk about how you want to implement them, in the sense that if you want to make a game with gamepad controls, it's likely a decision you're going to make very, very early on, okay? Honestly, I've left it a bit late for us to just fling controller inputs in, and we haven't even done that much, and you'll see why as we go in. But the reason I did that was because I didn't want to overload some of the early episodes with stuff with controller input as well as doing keyboard and mouse stuff at the same time, or at least that's the excuse I'm giving. I think it's a pretty good one. So yeah, but we're gonna do gamepad controls. We're gonna add movement, so left and right, and we'll make it so it varies a bit as well, since we'll be using an analog stick. I've got a 360 controller here that I'm gonna be using for this, and we'll use the axis so you can like walk a little bit by holding a little, or like run at full speed by holding it full tilt. Because that's one of the advantages of a controller, right? Normally, I suppose you wouldn't include both being able to analog and like move digitally as a design thing, but we'll do it here just to show it off, and also make it so you can aim with the controller and shoot with the controller, okay? As I say, I'm not going to carry on like making sure everything works perfectly between gamepad and keyboard for the entire of the series, but I am going to show you how to set it up so that if that's a thing that's important to you, you know how to get started, and you can more or less read the manual for all the rest of the information you're going to need in that regard. The important thing, as I said, is if you want to do it as early as you can, for a lot of reasons that we'll go into more as we actually set this up. So let's get started. So let's start off by opening our player object, okay? As you can see, the way we currently move around is just by we set up some variables and we literally just assign them to our keyboard checks, okay? Now, because of this, it makes it a little bit awkward, and this is why you need to do these things early if you want to put gamepad stuff in. You might have been able to think of a more elegant way of doing it than the way I'm about to do it. Because we've just assigned this value, and these are the absolute values, so keyboard check is always 1 or 0. It doesn't really have any room for in between. It kind of does a bit, and we're going to exploit that later, but the problem with that is now we basically need to say, well, but also if we're doing controller stuff, kind of overwrite those inputs rather than kind of sort of cleanly checking them both at once. So how we're going to do this is, first of all, I'm going to go into actually ignoring the step, and I'm going to pop quickly into the create event and type controller equals 0. Okay, and this variable is going to decide whether or not we're currently using a controller. The reason that's important is because the way we aim at the moment is using the mouse, which is fundamentally very, very different to how we would aim using, say, the right analog stick, okay, just to aim the gun around. So what we want to do is track whether or not we're currently pressing buttons and moving around using the keyboard, or whether we're currently moving around with the joypad, and basically swap between the two modes. You'll basically be able to do either at once, but like, and you can swap between them at any time. There's nothing stopping you. Just pick up the controller and you can start playing with the controller. But we need to track which one we're currently using to decide which method of gun aiming we want to use, okay? Because otherwise, at the moment, our gun tracks like our mouse constantly, so we need to tell it when to ignore the mouse and just do whatever we last told it to do with the analog stick. So that's the reason for that variable, and you see that coming into effect later. And this is what I mean by doing this stuff early, is because if we'd have built from the ground up with gamepad in mind, we might have decided, okay, mouse aiming is fundamentally very different to an analog stick. Is that the way we want to aim, and so on, you know. Might have raised other questions, and we might have thought about how we were going to structure it a bit differently, okay? It's not too bad, we're not really too late, like everything's not destroyed because we're doing it a bit later, but it is something you want to think about like right from the very beginning. Like, your control system should be the very, very first thing you kind of nail in your design. But anyway, let's get going with this. So the first thing I want to do is say if we've pressed any of these keys, then we can set controller to be 0. So I'm just going to quickly type if key left, or key right, or key jump. So if any of those have been pressed, if any single one of them is 1, I think I've shown you what the OR thing does before, I think we've been through that, So if that's 0, or if that's 1, or if that's 1, or if that's 1, this only won't happen if they're all 0, okay? Controller equals 0, okay? So we can set, if we've pressed any one of these, we know we're using the keyboard at this current time, and we don't have to worry later on. This won't make any difference until we get to the aiming part, but we don't have to worry later on when we're aiming. We don't have to worry about what the controller's doing if we know we're using the keyboard. Now we can go ahead and actually write in our controller stuff. So let's say if, open bracket, and I'll explain this after I've written it. So abs, and then open another bracket, gamepad axis value. Okay, because we're going to use the analog stick. So it's different from just getting like a binary 1 or 0 from like a key. Although you can do that for buttons and stuff on the gamepad. So there is a gamepad button check that works exactly the same way as keyboard check and so on. You just have to put in the right constants for whichever button you want to check, which we'll do a bit of later. Gamepad axis value, open bracket 0. That's our device slot, okay? Learn more about what device slots are and how many controllers you can have in at once. If you press F1, go into the documentation, read them on the gamepad page. You can have up to 4 slots for X input, which is things like 360 controllers and I think PS4 and Xbox One controllers. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure they're all X input as well. And then slots like 4 through 7 or something like that are for direct input, which is usually like older or different models of gamepad that you might want to use. You can read all about that stuff in your own time. 0, we're just putting 0 in here because it'll represent just the first controller you have plugged in. It's just a good default one if you're just setting it up and want a basic system that works. So I'm just going to use device 0 in every instance that we need a device input. I'm just going to use the number 0. And then we need to put in the axis index. Now there's a bunch of constants. What I mean by constants is these red values like VK space and so on that represent a specific thing and always represent that thing. And you can access them just by typing GP. You'll see all of them come up. You see all labeled constant, look. And the one we want is the constant that represents the left analog stick's horizontal axis, okay? And that's GP axis LH, okay? Left analog stick, horizontal axis, because each analog stick is broke up into like a vertical component, like how much you're holding it up and down, and how much you're holding it left to right. That's how they fundamentally work, okay? And what this function has done is basically returned where our left analog stick is in terms of its horizontal axis, which is all we care about for moving left and right. What we don't want to do is just set left and right to be whatever that analog value is, because if it's just tilting like the tiniest bit to the left, just because that's how it hangs by default, you'll move slowly to the left, and it'll be really weird when you think you're not pressing anything. What you do to solve this, it's a very old well-known technique, is just having what's called a dead zone on the controller, okay? So you need to have an amount of space that you're just touching the analog stick just the tiniest bit, and you ignore that kind of input. You only take input if it's above a certain amount of pushing in each direction. So we're gonna say greater than 0.2. Okay, well, let's close this around the abs as well. Because how axis value works is it returns value between -1, so that would be pushing fully to the left, and 1, pushing fully to the right, or like the same for up and down, like -1 to 1, okay? So the reason we put abs here is abs will take a value and will always return the positive version of that value. So if it's -7, by putting that through abs, you get 7, okay? Sorry, if it's negative 0.7, you put it through abs, you'll get positive 0.7. I hope I said that right. And if you put, say, positive 0.4, you'll get 0.4. And if you get negative 0.4, you'll get positive 0.4. Like, it just makes it positive no matter what it is, okay? Which is to say, so that it saves us saying that, like, if it's below negative 0.2 but above 0.2, we can just do it in one line by saying if the positive value of it is greater than 0.2. That means that we have to push it more than 0.2 in either direction for us to actually get a value back, okay? Sorry, that was a lot of explaining, but what this line does is just say if our left analog stick is beyond the dead zone, so we're using our left analog stick to move. then we can do some movement. And what we're going to do is, if that is the case, we'll overwrite whatever we're doing with our keyboard and we'll just prioritize the gamepad input. So I'm going to type key left equals abs min, I'll explain all these as we go again, gamepad axis value naught again, GP axis LH again, comma 0, close bracket, close bracket. Okay, and I'm going to write the second line at the same time, and I'll come back and explain them both. Equals, and we can skip the abs this time and just write max gamepad axis value naught GP axis LH close bracket comma 0 close bracket semicolon. Whew, okay, so basically we're overwriting key left, which at the moment is returning a 0 or a 1 based on whether or not it's A or D, right? And our key right returns a 0 or a 1. And the thing is, our system is based on that, right? It's based on the idea that like var move down here is key right minus key left. That only works if both of these values are between 0 and 1. So we can't use the negative 0.4 or whatever we might get from pushing the gamepad axis to the left. We can't set key left to be negative anything because the rest of our code doesn't know how to use that. We could rewrite this, but we're just going to write this in so it works with what we already have, okay? The way I do that is by putting abs in front of this, which forces this to be positive, so it forces it to be between 0 and 1. And then what I'm doing is I'm typing min, so it returns the smallest value between either what the axis is or 0. So keep in mind that if we're moving left, this value, say, like is negative 0.7 towards the left, okay? Negative 0.7 is smaller than 0, so min returns the smallest value, so negative 0.7 gets turned into positive 0.7, and then that's key left saying move as 0.7 in the left direction, which works with what we have, okay? Key right, on the other hand, we want to, and the other thing as well is if this returns, say, positive 0.7, positive 0.7 is bigger than 0, so 0 gets returned, and yeah, abs of 0 is 0 still, positive 0 is 0, and so key left is 0, so that stops us in moving right with key left or anything, okay? And key right is going to get the value again, so say this value is 0.7, 0.7 is bigger than 0, and max returns the biggest value, so 0.7 gets put into key right. Whereas if it was, say, negative 0.7 is smaller than 0, so 0 gets returned, okay? So that's how we make sure we're getting the right values into key left and key right there. It's a little bit complicated, but that's because we've just had to basically force this to work with how we had it set up originally with the keyboard and stuff to make it work. If I were just using gamepad and stuff, then I could probably just set key left to just equal the gamepad, the axis value, and key right to equal the axis value, and calculate our movement just based on that, and it would be simpler, but we're doing both at the same time, and we set it up based on just using a keyboard, so it's had to be a little bit wrangly to get it to fully work. And the last thing we want to do in here is just set controller to equal 1, okay? And that's just for our aiming later, just so we know that, okay, we're moving with the controller now, let's do controller aiming instead, okay? And then the last thing we need to do in the step event here is actually make it so we can jump as well. So I'm going to type if gamepad button check pressed device 0 again, and then GP brings up the constant list again, face 1. Okay, so that's there's face 1 through 4, and they represent the different faced buttons on the gamepad. If I just go into gamepad vision for a moment here, you can see the controller. GP1 is going to represent the button that's here generally, okay, because you know most controllers have a fairly standardized design at this point. You know, things might move around, but generally there's like 4 face buttons, a D-pad, 2 analog sticks, and a couple of things on the back, right? 4 thingies on the back. So like for X input, which is this type of standardized controller, GP face 1 represents this face button. I can't remember the order for the other 3, but they're GP face 2, 3, 4, and so on. I think 4 is Y. I'm not sure, but 1 is definitely the one at the bottom, which is the one we're going to use to jump. Okay, let's come back into normal vision. There we go. And so now that we've checked to see whether or not that button is pressed, it works exactly the same way as keyboard check pressed works. But the reason we're not just saying key jump equals this is because we don't want to just always overwrite this, because sometimes this will be 0. So we only want to overwrite this if this is 1, okay? Otherwise we know it's not pressed, and then we'll just rely on whatever the keyboard button was, so most of the time we'll get 0. But if either one of them is pressed, we overwrite it, essentially. So what I could have done as well is said like key jump equals this, and then done like an OR symbol and put this on. But the reason I'm not doing that just on this one line at the top is so that I can do controller equals 1 here when we're pressing this, so that we know we're using the controller. Okay, otherwise yeah, I could have just done that in one line up there. Key jump equals 1. Simple as that. We just overwrite it if we happen to be pressing it there. And let's close that bracket as well. I should get rid of all our red stuff. Yep. And now if I run the game, hopefully I'm not screwed anything up, and hopefully you're all still with me so far. You can see I can now move left and right. And let's put Gamepad Vision on again, just so you can kind of see it working. It's upside down. I'll try and play upside down a bit, I guess. You can see, yeah, that's the right one. There we go. Move in that analog stick, we move left and right. And also, importantly, our system just so happens, from the way we've worked it, to work in analog values, because we multiply our what used to be 1 and 0 with A and D by our move speed. We're now multiplying a value between 0 and 1, so we can actually move at a fraction of our full speed just by only holding down the stick a little bit. So you can see we can actually like kind of walk, and then if I hold it fully, we move at full speed in each direction, and we can just jump by pressing that. But you can see at any time as well, we can kind of return to our mouse and keyboard, and we can move around in that way just the same. Okay, so now what we need to do is put aiming in, okay? Because we can only currently aim with the mouse, and trying to aim with the mouse while playing with the gamepad, yeah, that's not really going to work, is it? So, unless you were kind of playing with 2 people, I guess. So, how do we do any of that? Well, all of our aiming and all of our gun stuff is controlled in our gun object, right? So we can close down our player object now and come into our gun object. First thing I want to do is go into the create event and add controller angle. Okay, and set that to equal 0. And that's going to be the angle that we want to aim in if we're currently using the controller, okay? Which we'll ignore if we're using the mouse for obvious reasons, but we'll use otherwise. So you can see at the moment we control everything with just this image angle equals point direction X, Y, mouse X, mouse Y line, okay? We just point towards where we want to be. And fortunately enough, every other thing in here relies on that, like the direction we shoot the bullets in just relies on our current image angle and so on. We've kept that fairly clean, which is good, because that makes it quite simple for us to implement our controller aim up here. We can just basically manipulate image angle to be whatever we need it to be, and then the rest will just sort of follow suit. It's very similar in the way to how we just did walk left and walk right and made that work. So I'm going to type if oPlayer dot, just as we did before, where by getting a value from another object, controller equals 0. Okay? And then I'm going to cut this line, this image angle equals our mouse aiming line fundamentally, and stick it in here. Okay, so now that we only do this if we're currently using keyboard and mouse, because if we're using keyboard and mouse, controller will be 0. If we do any kind of input on the joypad or the gamepad, controller will be 1, and we'll start ignoring this. Okay, so which is important, because otherwise the gun will just aim to wherever the mouse is on the screen, and it'll overwrite everything else, which we don't want, or it'll get overwritten depending which order. Either way, not what we want. So then we'll type else at the end of here. So this is now assuming that controller is 1, whatever we put in here. We need to do a bunch of things. The first thing we need to do is get the axis value of our right analog stick in the horizontal and vertical direction, okay? So I'm going to type 2 vars, because we're going to use these a couple of times, so by putting them into a var just makes it easier. Controller H, you can see that'll turn yellow in a second, or probably when I finish the line, I don't know. Oh, there it is. axis value, open bracket, device 0 as always, and then GP axis R for right analog stick, H for horizontal, okay? And that's controller H, that's going to be our horizontal axis, okay? Let's copy that line, paste it, put it as controller V this time for vertical, and just change the H from axis RH to a V, okay? You see it stayed red. Gamepad axis, right analog stick, vertical. Okay, so again, that's between -1 and 1 for how left and right it's being held, and -1 and 1 for how up and down it's being held, okay? That's a weird sentence, but I think you get what I meant. So once again, we need to check the dead zone, okay? We need to make sure we're not, not just sort of, just hanging loosely by default on a 0.01 in a direction or something like that, because then they'll override our mouse input and stuff when we don't want to just by having a controller plugged in, and it'll do all kinds of things we don't want it to do. So I'm going to type if abs, so again just returning always positive, controller H greater than 0.2. So I think that's fairly straightforward, right? So whether or not our horizontal axis is greater than 0.2, just the same as before, or abs controller V greater than 0.2. So either one, okay? If either one of these is more than 0.2, it means we're using that controller, so we're interested in actually aiming. The one bad thing, I guess, is that this is nestled inside already assuming that controller is 1. I suppose it would be a good idea if you were carrying on with controllers to do this sort of section outside of this loop somewhere as well, and just have it as another way to set controller to 1. But we're just keeping it simple for now, and you'll get the general idea and gist of how to do things, which is what's important. So, assuming we've passed that dead zone, have I closed this bracket properly? I think I have, yeah. So, assuming all that's the case, controller angle, which is about it's just 0 at the moment, is going to be set to point direction 0, 0, so like say the top left of the screen, but we're not really using it to mean the top left of the screen. We're just using it as a basis to work from so that we get an angle based on -1 and 1 and -1 and 1 left and right, okay? By using 0, 0 and point direction in this way, we can get an angle just based from those two values that are between 0 and 1, which is really, really useful. Controller H and controller V. So think about it. If, say we're holding all the way to the right, actually, let's say we're holding all the way up, for example, okay, so like -1, and we're not holding anything left and right on the analog stick. So just to make it absolutely clear, I guess, presume that we're doing that on the analog stick. Okay, we're just holding dead up. What does that mean? That means that controller V is going to be -1, okay, because it's going to be fully in the up direction, and controller H is going to be 0 because we're not moving left or right at all. So the point direction between 0, 0 in our room, but sort of not really, and 0 and -1 is going to give us the angle of up, okay? That's going to give us 90 degrees, okay? So 0 degrees is to the right, so 90 degrees from there, anti-clockwise, is up, okay? So it's going to return us 90. So it's a really useful way of just getting the exact direction that we want. Then, once we've got that, we can just say outside of this image angle equals controller angle, okay? And the reason we do those two things separately is so that we don't overwrite constantly when it's 0, okay? So when we're 0, when we're not holding the analog stick at all, we want to just leave ourselves aiming wherever we were aiming last. Otherwise, we'd have it, if we just set image angle to equal this all the time, actually, that might work, I don't know. But we have to be careful to make sure we don't, we don't make it so that the angle just always faces in the direction we're holding. So if I run that now, sorry if it looks like I'm struggling to click on things when I click on the top left, it's because my webcam for showing you the controller is kind of in the way, so I literally can't see my cursor when it's here on the screen. Anyway, if in the game now, if I move around, you can see the moment, you can see how that snapped, like when I start using the keyboard and mouse again, like, so like you can see like the gun is following that, but then when I move to the right, you can see it snapped down like that, and it's using whatever my controller angle is. But if I start to move around on the analog stick now, I can't really do both of these things on the webcam, so you just have to trust me that I'm doing it. You can see it's not following the mouse, at the very least. You can see it just aims wherever I point the stick, and it stays there, importantly, okay? So it stays there and doesn't just track back to the mouse, or doesn't just track straight back to 0. It stays wherever it should be, okay? And then if I go back to mouse and keyboard, it comes back to following the mouse around. Okay, so then the very last thing we need to do now is just make it so we can actually shoot, which is going to be very, very straightforward. Literally just going to add here where, this is the section in the gun where we fire, right? This if mouse check button, MB left, and then all our firing delay stuff on top. So I'm going to open a bracket at the start of that, close one at the end of it, just so we've wrapped it in some more, put some space in there, and I'm just going to say, or gamepad button check, device 0, GP shoulder RB. Okay, so if either the left mouse button is being checked or just that shoulder button is being pressed. Funnily enough, RB, you'd think RB would refer to the, well, RB on like a 360 pad, but actually refers, oddly enough, to whether or not I'm holding down the trigger, funnily enough. I know there is a way to get an axis out of the trigger so you can see how much you're pressing it. I don't know all the specifics. I don't work with controllers a lot, but yeah, that's making my trigger do it. So now I'll put the gamepad cam on one last time so you can kind of see like all this stuff in action. If you were actually designing this game with controller input in mind, one thing you might do, I suppose, is make it so you can just press up to jump on the analog stick rather than pressing A. Just because jumping and aiming is kind of at the same time is a bit impossible now, because you have to sort of swap between the two, or it's at least more difficult, which would infer a specific advantage to, sorry I kept that out of view for a bit there, but would keep that, there would be a kind of an advantage to playing on keyboard if you were to design it like that. But I'll leave all that stuff up to you, that's game design, you learn as you go, right? But that's it. That's adding controller input, and you can see it all comes back. It all still works on keyboard and mouse just as well. That's everything. That's controller input. We haven't dived into too much detail on a lot of different things, and a lot of different things you need to watch out for and stuff when dealing with controller input. But what I would recommend to you is, if controller pad is important to you, go read the documentation. It's very, very clear. And gives you lots and lots of info on all the stuff you need to be dealing with, and how to get the most out of your controller input. Okay, so just press F1, go to the gamepad section. There's a whole section, it's written very well, and it'll teach you how all of that stuff works. From this point onwards, we're not really going to delve much into controller input and all that kind of stuff. We're going to leave this in the game and stuff, so you can, you know, later on, if I release the source code or whatever, you can see how it all works. But this will be the last time we're really touching on gamepad stuff for this particular series, okay? Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in 3 weeks, because I'm going to have, the next week I'm having some time off to spend with my girlfriend, who's just got back from a 5-week training course thing, so we've got a week off together that we're going to have. So I'm going to be back in 2 weeks with another video on not platformer stuff, but I think it's tile collisions, and the week after that we'll be back with the platformer series. Okay, so 3-week wait for the continuation of the platformer series. Sorry about that, but we all do need a bit of time off now and again, and yeah, so I'll see you guys then. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks guys. Thank you as always to my awesome Patreon supporters. This week we've just hit over $500 a month. In order to celebrate that, I'm putting this video up completely ad-free, and it's going to stay that way forever, because ultimately that's my goal, is to be able to make videos completely ad-free that are just good quality stuff. And to do that, I need your support on Patreon. We'll get closer and closer to that goal every day. But in the meanwhile, a huge special shout out in particular to Dan, Inner Mule, Stephen Hagen, Alex Ray, Giles Montgomery, Rockzom, Harold Guidry, Jason McMillan, Angel Rodriguez, and Owen Morgan. Thank you all very much for your continued support. I'll see you guys in 2 weeks.